From 1878 to 1968, there were 71 lake captains that called Bayview, Wisconsin, on the shore of Lake Michigan, their home. While they lived here, they captained 195 different ships, from tugboats to schooners to steamships, in voyages that took them to every one of the Great Lakes. Join us now for another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we explore not only these captains, but also their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes.
Hello everyone. My name is Doug Mintline. I'm a retired U.S. Navy commander. I'm sitting in the front parlor, the cozy front parlor, of the historic Johanna Brach House, Bayview's only female ship owner, at 515 East Lincoln Avenue in Bayview. Bringing you the very first episode that we have for our Lake Captain series here on YouTube. There were 71 captains total. But before we jump into the captains specifically, I thought it important to summarize Bayview's spectacular maritime history as told through its lake captains. It's really great. I think you'll enjoy it. A lot of the information is brand new, so new history for you Bayviewers out there. I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce you to our professionally trained narrator, theater trained also, Simon Stanhope from England. Now Simon has a website, he has a YouTube channel called Bite Size Audio, where he provides narrations for English literature classics of the Victorian and Edwardian eras, ghost stories, suspense stories, detective stories. They're great. And here's the link, and I've also provided it at the end of the video. Now the reason that I wanted Simon is because, one, I've listened to his channel before and it's excellent, but also the majority of Bayview's lake captains were immigrants, and they immigrated from Northern Europe, England, Scotland, Ireland, and so I thought it would be appropriate to have someone from that part of the world where our lake captains immigrated from to do the narration. So I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope you'll enjoy Simon. This particular episode is the longest. I hope I don't wear you out. It's not quite an hour and a half, but I wanted to lay it all out for you so you know the background before we got into each individual captain. Those episodes for those captains are about, I'm estimating, about 10 to 15 minutes. So if you can hang in there through this long one, which I think you'll enjoy, that's where we're going. Shorter episodes, you can kind of jump in and jump out. I don't want to wear you out. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Simon Stanhope now, who will take you through Bayview's spectacular maritime history. And remember, hats off to our Bayview Lake captains. See you next time. Bye. Okay, now let's try that. That's a better one. Okay, let's give this a shot. Hopefully this will work.
Welcome to the first installment of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we discuss the lives of the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview, Wisconsin, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the age of sail and steam. This discussion will include their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes. Here is the map of lake captains' homes in Bayview, to show you where this important history of Bayview takes place. From 1878 to 1968, that's 90 years, 71 lake captains called Bayview home. They captained 195 different ships while they lived here. All of the information in this and all future episodes is the result of nearly a decade of research, analysis, and writing, culminating in a book titled Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, written by Commander Douglas D. Mintline, USNR. He is the founder of this channel, who owns and has restored the home at 515 East Lincoln Avenue that once belonged to Johanna Broch, Bayview's first and only female shipowner, and her husband, Captain John Broch, Bayview's most prolific schooner captain. Commander Mintline also has written a second book specifically about Captain Broch, his wife Johanna, and her older brother, William Draves, titled A Brother Helps His Sister, the true story of William A. Draves, the schooner Arctic, and the house at 515 East Lincoln Avenue. There were over 400 lake captains in Milwaukee's history. In order to determine which of these were in Bayview, the boundaries shown here were used. What follows next is a much compressed introduction from the book that contains the research discoveries about all of the 71 captains discovered. The images that accompany this narration are, unless otherwise noted, photos of actual Bayview lake captains, their ships, their homes, and their families, and are the result of many years of research. In addition, the specifics and identities of these families and captains mentioned will be covered both in future episodes and are already in the book, Bayview, Town of Lake Captains. So, viewers wanting more information can either stay tuned for these future episodes, or they can buy the book, details available on our website. We will now begin our discussion of Bayview's great and substantial maritime history, as told through its 71 lake captains. Note that none of the names of the captains, ships, family members, or home addresses have been provided here, so as to encourage the listener and reader to follow the complete episodes after this one on each captain. Even further details are provided in the two aforementioned books, along with the sources. If today one goes to visit the port of Yarmouth on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, they will find all the homes of former ship captains identified to passers-by with small markers on the front of each house. Their captains' homes, concentrated, as would be expected, around the port, are in an area not unlike Bayview, called Old Yarmouth. The captains and their former homes are a cherished and celebrated part of Old Yarmouth's history. The Historical Society of Old Yarmouth proudly proclaims and celebrates its substantial maritime heritage on its website. Quote, "Approaching Yarmouth, you'll enter the Captain's Mile. Curving and meandering, the road runs past historic inns and old stone walls covered with lichen, while stretching out along both sides sit over 50 homes once owned by sea captains." Unquote. The Historical Society of Old Yarmouth features self-guided walks to view its ship captains' homes, downloadable from its website to anyone out walking with their phone. It has also placed a plaque in the form of a schooner, the Great Lakes' most numerous vessels in history, not a clipper ship, on each of its captains' homes. A tab on the Society's website is devoted entirely to their captains' homes. Another tab provides help and encouragement for citizens of Old Yarmouth to research their homes to learn their history. Old Yarmouth only happens to be the one picked here to illustrate how other communities have chosen to honour and promote their maritime history through their sea captains. The same could be said for other locations, such as Nantucket, Massachusetts. Go further up the U.S. eastern seaboard to the coast of Maine, and you'll find the same thing, as well as other locations along the way. The residents of each of these towns can tell visitors all about each captain and their families that once lived in the neighbourhoods. It's part of their culture, part of their history, part of their proud maritime tradition. It's embedded in the fabric of life there. Yet, if that same visitor travels to any port in the Great Lakes, including Wisconsin, they'll find no such markers or designations. Residents have no idea they're walking past a Great Lakes ship captain's house. Actually, they called themselves lake captains. Nobody knows, and that includes the residents of Bayview, Wisconsin. Old Yarmouth is proud of its maritime heritage, embodied in its 55 sea captains. But, folks, Bayview had 71. 71! During Commander Mintline's 8 years of researching and writing this book, and its companion volume, he noticed that Great Lakes maritime researchers, historians and writers past and present focus almost exclusively on ships and shipwrecks, the inanimate objects. There has been comparatively little interest in the people, the captains, crews, owners, and their families. Certainly, ships and shipwrecks are part of the story. Some of these are included in the slides that follow, as well as in future episodes on this channel. All of them are provided in great detail in both aforementioned books. Absolutely, ships and shipwrecks are interesting and part of the story, and the diving photos on the wrecks are also great. But the homes of the captains of these very same ships can also still be observed and photographed too. It's where they lived. It's where they raised their families. Their homes were as big a part of their lives as their ships were. And most of Bayview's lake captains' homes, 64%, are still standing. So what is it about the culture out on the US East Coast that results in the towns and cities embracing the history of their ship captains, families and homes? Perhaps it's because the homes are older, and their ships also included, though not always, the famous clipper ships that sailed across the oceans and the globe. They were sea captains, not lake captains. But when it comes to the sailing adventures, the hardships, the daring and the courage of their captains, Old Yarmouth, Nantucket or Maine don't have anything on Bayview's lake captains. The stories you will read in the pages of Commander Mintline's 2 books, as well as conveyed here and in future episodes on this channel, prove it. Yet Wisconsin has exclusively placed only ships and shipwrecks, sitting unseen on the bottom of Lake Michigan, on the National and State Historic Registers. As of this writing, 1 Great Lakes ship captain's house in the entire state of Wisconsin has been given a historic marker of any kind, or been designated as a national, state, or local historic landmark. Most of Bayview's lake captains' homes, 75 out of 118, or 64%, are still standing. Shouldn't history recognize them? And it's not just the captains' homes that haven't been recognized. No Great Lakes Ship Captains Historic District exists in Wisconsin or anywhere else in the Great Lakes either. Bayview has the chance to be the first, and being first also means being first not just in Wisconsin, but also in America. The books by Commander Mintline, upon which this channel is based, serve many purposes, but perhaps the most important one is the assembly and consolidation of research on Bayview's lake captains that can then be used to assemble the necessary paperwork to make the applications for the above-mentioned historic district, National Register, State Register, Maritime Trail, etc. Applications for all of these have already been submitted in conjunction with the launch of the books and this channel. This new historic Bayview Lake Captains District will overlap and coexist with the current historic district. While the greatest concentration of lake captains in Bayview lived outside of the current district, this new district will complement the existing one, adding to Bayview's great history and diverse heritage. It's not all about the captains either. Their families need to be included. For those that have been to sea professionally, as the founder of this channel, Commander Mintline, has, the thing that matters most to them is their crews and their families. Next is the mission. Third is the ship. The best example of that, in sailors' lives, people matter more than ships, can be found in the old movie PT 109. The heroic actions of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, Lieutenant Junior Grade, USNR, and Captain of the 109 are depicted in the movie. At one point during the film, when Kennedy and his crew are missing, the forward half of the 109 has been observed by Navy patrol aircraft and is still afloat but absent of any crew. Kennedy's commanding officer then informs the rescue team, "Look, I don't want the hull of the 109 back. I want the crew that stood on the deck of the 109 back." That's absolutely right. These were men. They had lives. They had families. So any history that's written or recorded in a future Bayview Historic Lake Captains District, such as online guided walking tours of the captains' homes and their biographies found on this website, necessarily needs to include their families. As previously mentioned, after 8 years of research and analysis, it was determined there were 71 Bayview Lake captains. The criteria to be included in this 71 is simple. In order to be considered a Bayview Lake captain, they had to actually captain a ship while they lived in Bayview. Otherwise, they're former or future Bayview Lake captains. Not only that, but when Bayview residents are out walking, they can pull up our website on their phones to find free self-guided online walking tours by street of Bayview Lake captains' homes. With Bayview surrounded on 3 sides by water, it's not surprising that the area closest to both the port of Milwaukee and the Kinnickinnic River would house the highest concentration and highest number of Bayview Lake captains in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Before automobiles, they would have walked to their ships, and these ships could only dock in the port or on the river. The majority, 66 of the 118 total homes of Bayview's 71 lake captains over a 90-year period, from 1878 to 1968, are found in this northwestern area. Far and away the majority of captains that commanded sailing ships, as opposed to steamships, in Bayview's history, by an 18-5 margin, are also to be found up here. This northwestern area was also the oldest in terms of when the captains lived there, making it a pretty good chance that their homes were among the oldest too. Yet, incredibly, the existing 1982 Bayview Historic District application, submitted to the U.S. National Register, that was subsequently approved, justifies the exclusion of this part of Bayview from the district by stating that, quote, "residential development and the character of Bayview do not exist north of the boundary, which is Russell Avenue," unquote. The word character isn't defined further, and the homes of greatest concentration of lake captains in Bayview's history are not only not even acknowledged, they're reported as not even to exist. When plotted out, it's clear to see that as time and the years progress, the captains moved south and east, simultaneously converting over to steamships and away from sail as they went. The numbers and concentration of the captains' homes also become fewer with the advancement of years. The area to the far west of the northwestern, quote, "highest concentration of captains," unquote, area, adjoining Kinnickinnic River, is especially interesting. 7 of Bayview's lake captains had houses up on the bluff, Burrell Street, above the Kinnickinnic River as it turns south. These were all captains of sailing ships, schooners all, making it likely they moored them to a simple pier at the bottom of the hill on the Kinnickinnic River, and then walked up to their homes on the bluff by East Clarence Street, depicted in a watercolour painting by Spanish artist Antonio Ribas, in this volume's companion book, A Brother Helps His Sister. The shallower draft, depth of the hull below the waterline, of schooners made river transit possible compared to steamships. Altogether, Bayview Lake captains commanded 195 different ships from 1878 to 1968, while they lived in Bayview. And then, both before and after coming to live in Bayview, they captained many more. The most prominent street in Bayview, when it comes to lake captains, was East Lincoln Avenue. It was literally the ship captain's row of the late 19th century Bayview, having the highest number of both lake captains, 9, and lake captains' homes, 11. This shouldn't be a surprise, as East Lincoln Avenue is the major thoroughfare adjoining the southern half of the port of Milwaukee. Without a doubt, East Lincoln Avenue was Bayview's most important and significant maritime street. In addition to being Bayview's ship captain's row, as discussed in the previous slide, East Lincoln Avenue was also home to the first, 1878, and last, 1968, homes of Bayview Lake captains, its youngest lake captain, age 17, its most prolific schooner captain, 3 to 5 different schooners, and its only female shipowner. Before roads, trucks, and even the superior train routes of today, the primary means of getting goods to destinations was by Great Lakes shipping. A common cargo and route was grain from Milwaukee to Buffalo, returning with cargo holds full of coal to heat homes in Milwaukee over the winter. A fleet of schooners carrying grain once raced each other over this route, and this wasn't unusual. From passengers, cross-lake, interlake, and local excursion, to rail cars, to freshly cut trees from northern Wisconsin and Michigan for Milwaukee's lumber yards, to finished products from Bayview's rolling mill, to iron ore from Lake Superior, to boulders to build Racine's breakwater, to cobblestones from Lake Superior to put in between the tracks of Milwaukee's streetcar system. These cargoes and more were transported by Bayview Lake captains from Milwaukee to and from all 5 of the Great Lakes, plus many times up and down the coast of Wisconsin. In these earlier days, before much larger and therefore fewer ships carried Great Lakes cargoes, it was common for lake captains, though not all, to own their own ships. Most of these were schooners, and they numbered several thousand during their heyday on the Great Lakes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Schooner captains that owned and sailed their own ships were essentially running their own businesses. They knew the harbour masters at many ports, and thus were often aware of what cargo-carrying opportunities became available and when. These were independent operators, and weren't tied to any shipping companies. Their captains alone decided where the schooner sailed. If they delivered a cargo and found the queue to pick up a return cargo to take back to Milwaukee or another port was long, like in Buffalo waiting for coal, for example, they could just decide to weigh anchor, raise the ship's anchor on their own, and sail off to another port, to Cleveland, for example, to get coal for the return journey. Other Bayview Lake captains worked for other ship owners. These were shipping lines and shipping companies, and also some private businesses, such as lumber yard owners that owned and operated several ships to keep it supplied. Over half of Bayview's 71 lake captains were immigrants. This breaks down as follows: 35 immigrants, 49%; 30 US-born, 42%; 6 unknown, 8%. Of the US-born captains, just 17 were from Wisconsin, and of those only 7 were from Milwaukee, and of those only 1 was from Bayview. That makes just 8 of Bayview's lake captains out of the 71 total from Milwaukee, 11%. On average, Bayview's immigrant captains didn't become naturalized U.S. citizens until 15 years after their arrival, most of them sailing and captaining ships on the lakes until that registration process was complete. Immigrating also presented its own set of obstacles. 2 Bayview lake captains were separated from their siblings at the time that either their parents or they immigrated from Ireland and Norway. They wouldn't see these siblings again for 60 and 49 years respectively, reunited finally again in Bayview. In their own lives, 11 of them, 16%, lost their father when they were children, forcing them to grow up in hardship, and for some to begin working to support their families at very young ages. When their fathers died, 10 were below age 10, and 1 was age 16, who also lost his mother at the same time. 38%, 27 out of 71, began sailing professionally before age 18, with this group having an average starting age of 16. 2 even started at age 12. Another Bayview lake captain achieved, during his lifetime, the title, for the period, of being both youngest, 21, and oldest, 77, captain on the Great Lakes. Another had 2 sons that were the youngest officers on the Great Lakes at the time. Before coming to Bayview, 11 Bayview lake captains sailed the world's oceans as teenage crewmen as young as 13, and 1 a few years older as a sea captain, on the grandest sailing ships ever built, to include the famous clipper ships, making ports of call literally all over the world, in most, if not all, of the world's oceans. 1 had even been a whaler in the Arctic Ocean, and may have participated in the greatest maritime rescue attempt in world history. 3 sailed around Cape Horn, southern tip of South America, and the Cape of Good Hope, southern tip of Africa, among the roughest seas in the world, multiple times. 1 did it in the course of 2 round-the-world voyages as a sea captain, before later moving to Bayview and settling down in a small, unassuming house on Mound Street. These 11 had substantial sailing experience in salt water before taking on the challenges of fresh water. The oceans and seas they are documented to have sailed in these pre-Bayview early years were, in alphabetical order, Atlantic Ocean, Arctic Ocean, Arctic Circle, Baltic Sea, Barents Sea, Black Sea, Caribbean Sea, Celtic Sea, South China Sea, English Channel, possibly the Labrador Sea, Greenland Sea, Indian Ocean, Sea of Japan, Mediterranean Sea, North Sea, Norwegian Sea, Pacific Ocean, South Pacific Ocean, Philippine Sea, and the White Sea. Their documented ports of call were, in alphabetical order, Algiers, on the north coast of Africa, Archangel, in the White Sea, southeast of Murmansk, northern Russia, Calcutta, India, Hong Kong, China, Kobe, Japan, Macau, China, Manila, Philippines, Shanghai, China, Singapore, Odessa, in the Black Sea, Sydney, Australia, South America, and the South Pacific Islands. These are the ones that are documented. There were undoubtedly more. To say they were experienced sailors wouldn't approach what they accomplished. Bayview's lake captains weren't posers. They were the real deal. They epitomized the very best that can today be found when describing Great Lakes captains. Together, their combined years sailing both the Great Lakes and the world's oceans and seas totaled 2,330 years. That comes to an average of 32.82 years of sailing professionally for each Bayview lake captain. Many of them worked captaining ships right up to the day they died. Over 1/3, 26, were born before the Civil War, average birth date of 1851, and 3 were born during it. Of this 29 total, all but 3 were immigrants. The earliest born Bayview Lake captain was in 1828 in England, a full 33 years before the Civil War. 3 captains' birth and death dates are unknown. The captain that accumulated the second longest years on the lake, an astonishing 61 years, lived the longest, to age 97. 3 of Bayview's lake captains are documented to have been contracted to transport cargoes, both to raw iron by 1 captain, and from finished manufactured products by 2 captains, the Bayview rolling mill that had been built by Detroit's Eber Brock Ward. There were undoubtedly others. One of these was captain and owner of a ship that had once been owned by, and built originally for, Eber Brock Ward, though years after Ward's death it was sailing under a different name. He used Ward's former ship to tow a schooner barge behind him that was captained by his brother, also a Bayview Lake captain. Both were carrying rolling mill cargo, though only one of the brothers lived in Bayview at the time. 2 more actually served aboard 2 of Eber Brock Ward's former ships, one as a mate, who also lived aboard, the other as a wheelsman. Another Bayview Lake captain, not connected to the above 3, had once been the wheelsman for a year on a ship that had 3 years before been part of Eber Brock Ward's sons, Eber Ward Jr.'s fleet. It was truly a family affair when it came to being Bayview Lake captains. Of the 71 different captains, 28, 39%, were relatives. There were 8 sets of brothers, 3 sets of fathers and sons, and 1 set of cousins. They often sailed together. They and their families often lived together too, or close to each other, some houses right across the street from each other, for most of their time in Bayview. Of the 118 total homes of Bayview Lake captains, 14 were lived in by the 1 set of brothers alone. Also of interest is that of these 28 that were relatives, 57% of them were immigrants. They averaged just over a 7th grade education, and only 1 graduated from high school. Not one of Bayview's 71 lake captains had a college degree, instead learning and advancing using on-the-job training. They captained steamships more than any other type. Just the propulsion system on these steamships was very complicated, let alone the many other intellectually challenging parts of sailing, like navigating using sextants. Yet they handled it just fine with their 7th grade educations and on-the-job training. The son of Bayview's last lake captain, who lived on East Lincoln Avenue and captained a ship while living there until 1968, became the most famous and celebrated ballet dancer and choreographer in the world. Over his life, he was the subject of an astonishing 22 feature articles in Milwaukee newspapers and 6 photo sets with captions. After being separated from her brother during the immigration process to the U.S. from Norway in 1880 and landing initially in Minnesota before moving out west, another Bayview Lake captain's sister, who was reunited with him at his Bay Street home 49 years later, became quite familiar with a man named James J. Hill, railroad tycoon and builder of the famous Great Northern Railway Transcontinental Railroad from Minnesota to Seattle. So successful was Hill that he acquired the nickname Empire Builder. Later, after his death, this route was named the Empire Builder in his honor by Amtrak in 1929, which continues to operate this train today from Chicago to Seattle. His sister was one of the first passengers in 1893 to travel on Hill's famous Great Northern Railway from Minnesota to the U.S. West Coast. She said she knew Hill, and that he was a fine man and a great pioneer. Another's father is one of Milwaukee's great sailing legends, that in his early youth in Europe became famous in those maritime circles, acquiring the nickname the Boy Captain, after he captained a schooner across the Atlantic Ocean from England to Canada, at age 16. The brother of another either captained or served aboard lightships for 20 years, and the brother of still another was the lighthouse keeper for Milwaukee's Pierhead Light, still in existence today, for many years, at least 1 year of which he lived on Bayview's Wentworth Avenue, thus making him Bayview's only documented lighthouse keeper that actually lived in Bayview while keeping the light. He also later set up Bayview's only fish store that would sell his family's catch. Another captain's brother, also a lake captain, though living on Jones Island at the time, was killed in World War I, a full 2 years before America entered the war, and he was fighting for Germany. Yet another's father is reported in his early days to have been an engineer on the very first steam-powered railroad locomotive ever built in America. And lots more. Remember, as mentioned previously, the specifics and identities of these families and captains mentioned will be covered in future episodes, and are already in the book, Bayview, Town of Lake Captains. All of Bayview's lake captains were men, but one, Johanna Broch, was Bayview's first, one and only female ship owner. Her husband, John Broch, was also Bayview's most prolific schooner captain. Full details about her and John, their family, and their restored 1890 folk Victorian house at 515 East Lincoln Avenue, which has been approved for a historic marker from the Wisconsin Historical Society, are provided not only in a future episode on this channel, but also in the 550-page book titled A Brother Helps His Sister, The True Story of William A. Draves, the Schooner Arctic, and the House at 515 East Lincoln Avenue, written by Commander Doug Mintline, USNR. This historic marker will be the first home of either a female ship owner or ship captain to be recognized historically in the entire state of Wisconsin, and the first marker from the Wisconsin Historical Society to be placed in Bayview in 26 years. The dedication date will be this coming summer, so stay tuned for more specifics regarding the exact date, time, and other important and interesting information. In order to prove Johanna was Bayview's first and only, all female shipowners in Milwaukee history had to be researched, and their homes when they were shipowners located. This information will also be the subject of a future episode. It is also mentioned in both the aforementioned book as well as its companion volume, Bayview, Town of Lake Captains. These books and this channel are the first time ever, anywhere, all of Milwaukee's female shipowners have been researched and published, and it exists nowhere else. Bayview's lake captains were tugboat captains, fishing boat captains, fireboat captains, schooner captains, and steamship captains. While living in Bayview, they captained 195 different ships. They all faced the same challenges and dangers that sailing the lakes entailed. The International Shipmasters Association, ISMA, recognized them all as lake captains, especially the smaller ones like fishing and tugboats. As previously mentioned, 17%, or 23 out of 71, of Bayview's lake captains commanded sailing ships. However, the highest group out of the 195 different ships they captained while living in Bayview were steamships, numbering 67, or 34%. The most prolific lake captain in Bayview history was a Norwegian immigrant. he captained 16 different steamships while living in the same house on Oklahoma Avenue for over 4 decades. Who is he? Where exactly on Oklahoma Avenue did he live? Stay tuned for a future episode. The first and founding president of the Milwaukee branch of the International Shipmasters Association, ISMA, was a Bay Viewer, and 5 other lake captains from Bayview followed him later on into that position. One of these went on to become the ISMA's national president. One Bayview lake captain, a tugboat captain, was an ISMA member for over 50 years. Several Bayview lake captains were selected by owners to be the first captains of brand new and important ships in Great Lakes maritime history. These include what remains to this day the largest passenger liner on the lakes, as well as the lake's very first self-unloading cargo ship. One captain that lived on Dover Street was chosen to command the largest steamship ever built in Milwaukee. Another carried the largest ever cargo of grain of a wooden-hulled steamship on its maiden voyage, which was from Milwaukee to Buffalo. On the return trip, it brought back the largest ever cargo of coal carried by a wooden-hulled ship to date in Great Lakes history. 18 years later, this same captain, on a different ship, carried the largest cargo of any kind in Great Lakes history at the time. There were others. They either captained, served aboard, or were connected to some of the lakes and maritime history's most interesting ships. 2 commanded famous whaleback ships. One of these captains even later managed an entire whaleback fleet. 2 more captained schooners that were so old they hailed as true pioneering ships of the lakes, while they lived right behind each other on East Liner Street and East Lincoln Avenue. There's also a Bayview lake captain whose ship was the centerpiece of, and which hosted the formal funeral ceremony for, Milwaukeean Edward G. Crosby, who had owned the ship, who drowned in the famous ocean liner RMS Titanic disaster. Of interest, this is the same ship, though then under a different name and a different Bayview lake captain, that brought in all of the Hotel Fista's beautiful brand new furniture in time for its grand opening in 1893. Some Great Lakes and Bayview quote-unquote warships were also captained by Bayview's resident captains. One was the captain of the only Great Lakes ship specifically and uniquely designed and built to be converted over, in less than 24 hours, to a U.S. Navy big gun cruiser, over concerns that the British were secretly making plans to try to take over the lakes, as if it were the War of 1812 all over again. A different Bayview lake captain commanded a private yacht that was converted from a Spanish Navy gunboat, homeported in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, that the U.S. Navy seized at war's end in 1898. A Milwaukee owner subsequently bought it, converted it into a yacht, and sailed it out of Bayview, where it was home-ported and docked on the Kinnickinnic River. It could thus be said in history to be a Bayview warship. Years later, after its yachting days concluded, it sank next to a pier by the Beecher Street Bridge. But that wasn't the only warship with a Bayview connection. A couple of decades later, a different personal 126-foot sailing yacht of one of Milwaukee's industrial titans, Irwin C. Uline, president of Schlitz Brewing Company, was captained by 2 different Bayview lake captains after their retirement from conventional lake captain careers, one immediately before and the other right after World War II. Reports indicate that during the war, the yacht was requisitioned by the U.S. Navy for patrol duty in the Atlantic and is credited with sinking 2 different German U-boats. It was even powered by a German U-boat engine from World War I. And speaking of World War I, Another Bayview Lake captain served as an officer aboard a U.S. Navy battleship in that war that had, 15 years earlier, been one of the famous and legendary Great White Fleet ships sent by President Theodore Teddy Roosevelt to show the U.S. flag around the Western Pacific. In addition to Uline's yacht mentioned above, that was captained by two different Bayview Lake captains, one before and the other after World War II, yet another Bayview Lake captain, the third one, commanded not one but two personal and family sailing yachts of another of Milwaukee's famous industrial titans, Bruno Nordberg. So yes, it's true. Bayview Lake captains were the go-to captains of Milwaukee's rich and famous to sail their huge, private, and beautiful sailing yachts around the Great Lakes. Bayview Lake captains also made history through their many actions and events. One such action was conducting the first ever, and perhaps only, open lake transfer of passengers from a passenger aircraft to a ship in the middle of Lake Michigan in Great Lakes history. Another captain that lived on Mound Street was vectored to help another ship in distress by a circling DC-3 airliner based in Chicago, whose pilot lived in Tippecanoe. A Bayviewer towed two barges containing 28 railroad cars each behind his tug from Marinette to Chicago, the first time in Great Lakes history anything like this had ever been attempted. And still another towed a U.S. Navy cruiser in the narrow channel with his tugboat as part of the grand opening ceremonies and celebrations of the St. Lawrence Seaway in 1959. Lots more similar history was made by Bayview's lake captains. Lots more. At least 3 are documented as having taken their wives and part of their families with them on lake voyages. This wasn't at all unusual for the day, and it's highly likely many others did as well. There's just no documentation of it. Christmas tree ships have been commonly celebrated and written about often in Great Lakes maritime research circles. At least 2, and possibly 4, Bayview Lake captains both captained and owned 2 and very possibly 3 different Christmas tree ships that were exclusive to Bayview, meaning they were owned, captained, and home-ported there. Christmas trees were just one of the cargoes they carried in the off-season, but probably the most memorable. They would sail to northern Michigan and Wisconsin to get the trees to bring back to Bayview. One of these ships sank near Green Bay while en route to Bayview and Milwaukee with a load of trees with 2 and likely 3 Bayview Lake captains aboard. They all survived. It was subsequently raised, as many were in those days, and sailed again. Before there were roads and trucks, bringing in cargo via the lake was the only way to get things. Many winters, Bayviewers owed getting their Christmas trees to these 2 captains and their ships. 10 were rail car ferry captains. The term rail car denotes ships that carried either railroad cars or, later, automobiles. Collectively, their total time between them as lake captains of rail car ferries for their careers, while living in Bayview, was over 80 years. It can be legitimately said that Bayview's car ferry captains dominated Lake Michigan car ferries during a truly historic time. One Bayview Lake captain during this time was promoted to the fleet superintendent for Grand Trunks car ferries. In doing so, he became the boss of 3 other Bayviewers that were captaining car ferries during his tenure. Another took over as captain of the very same car ferry that his father had captained 15 years before. 4, and possibly 5, were born on Jones Island. When Jones Islanders were evicted in about 1917, some of them moved to Bayview. One of these, a Bayview Lake captain and fisherman of legendary proportions, actually raised his house on Jones Island up off its foundations and transported it up the huge hill. Imagine that undertaking before trucks, to Bayview, where it remains standing today. As previously mentioned, only one of the 71 Bayview lake captains was born in Bayview. Amazingly, he was born, raised, lived and died in the same Bayview house. He was also the most entrepreneurial of Bayview's lake captains, using his own ships in pre-automobile days for summer excursion trips from South Shore Park to Juneau Park and back for 25 cents round trip for adults, 15 cents for children. He built a pier at South Shore Park with his own money to dock his excursion ships. Then he used these ships for sailing cargo in the off-season. But he wasn't the only one with an entrepreneurial interest. Another Bayview lake captain, outside of sailing, started his own jitney bus company in the 1920s, the forerunner to today's modern Milwaukee County bus service. The founder of Bayview, Eber Brock Ward, was a lake captain first, documented to have captained, though not in Bayview, 5 different ships before moving on to build a monstrously successful shipping business, where he ended up owning 50 ships, specifically identified in a special section in the second half of the book, Bayview, Town of Lake Captains. He didn't build the Bayview rolling mill until the end of his sailing and shipping career. 6 of Bayview's 8 fireboat captains started out first as captains of traditional ships before moving to captaining fireboats. The reason for the move was likely the safety, stability, relatively regular and predictable hours and pay, and, probably most important, the chance to be at home every night and have summer weekends with their families. Lake captains were gone most of the time, from April to December every year, only making it home in winter when the lakes froze up, except for the fishermen who went out year-round. Could it have also been possible that it was safer fighting fires than sailing the Great Lakes at that time? Interestingly, one of the other 2 captains of the 8 mentioned above went in the opposite direction, from fireboats to traditional lake sailing. What happened to the other one is unknown. Finally, one of the 8 was killed in an accident aboard the Milwaukee fireboat he was captaining. He is the only fireboat captain in Wisconsin history to be killed in the line of duty. 23 different ships were captained over the years by more than one Bayview lake captain. This trading off of ships between each captain is but one indicator that they were a close-knit group and knew each other and their respective families quite well as Bayviewers. There are also several examples of Bayview lake captains coming up through the ranks, being trained by and serving under other Bayview lake captains. Only one ship that was ever captained by a Bayview lake captain still exists in its original state and condition, a perfectly preserved time capsule. Today it's a museum ship, the SS City of Milwaukee, and bed and breakfast in northern Michigan, and can be toured by anyone from Bayview wishing to set foot on a part of Bayview's maritime history. It was captained by at least 2 and likely 3 different Bayview captains for at least 22 years combined total, likely longer to 25 years. One more Bayview lake captain also once served aboard as a young officer. There was, too, a pilot house of another ship that was saved in 1973, whose deck another Bayview lake captain once walked, that became a private club in Toronto, Canada, though it's uncertain if it still exists. A second pilot house of a different Bayview lake captain was also saved and still existed in Canada in 2017, though its existence now is uncertain. Another ship, now a museum ship in Muskegon, Michigan, named the Milwaukee Clipper, also once had a Bayview Lake captain command it, though that was before he came to Bayview, when it was named Juniata. But it has been so substantially altered, inside and out, that it looks much different from the time he captained it. Fishing boat captains were among the bravest. They went out onto Lake Michigan year-round, and their fishing grounds weren't just offshore. No, they were 21 miles out into the lake. Taking a tiny boat out into Lake Michigan in late January was no easy task. They and their crews also pulled in the nets by hand, in the cold and snow, as the boat got tossed around in the wind and waves, literally like a toy. One Bayview Lake captain's near brush with death is especially worth telling. After taking his fishing boat out to the offshore fishing location mentioned above, the boat's boiler went out and the engine stopped during a period of huge winds and waves, with the temperature well below zero. It was early March 1913, and the boat was already covered literally in ice. With no power to sail back the 21 miles to port and safety, and with no heat now inside the cabin, he and the crew began to slowly freeze to death. Attempts at starting a fire failed with the wet wood they tried to burn. Down to their last match, the captain remembered that there was a telephone book inside the cabin, and it was still dry. They lit their final match to it, and the fire began and then continued successfully. After getting warmed up, a crewman and future Bayview Lake captain then left the cabin to crawl out onto the top of it, which was covered in ice, as the boat was bouncing around in the rough seas and wind. From there, he was able to access the top boiler hatch and made the repairs. The engine started again, and they set a course for home. The boat sailed into port looking like a giant ice cube, but they were alive. These captains and men were exceptionally strong and tough. 5 of these lake captains moved over to Bayview when they got evicted from Jones Island by the city of Milwaukee shortly after the First World War. Still another drowned in the exact same place and manner his father did 45 years earlier, neither of their bodies ever being found. Of all of Bayview's lake captains, the fishermen and their families may have been the closest, perhaps because of the great danger they faced each day, sailing out into Lake Michigan, no matter the weather, to catch their fish. Tugboats and their captains in this volume didn't just hang around inside the calm harbour. They would often pull barges or other floating cargo to various ports up and down Lake Michigan. For example, one Bayview Lake captain often towed crippled ships from Milwaukee to South Chicago and Sturgeon Bay for repairs. It was also their routine to go out into Lake Michigan in the teeth of huge storms to rescue ships in trouble. Like fishermen, they did this in the foulest and most perilous weather, their tiny tugs a fraction of the large ships and barges they towed. Danger was ever present for them, and there are quite a few accounts of their heroics in the episodes that follow. Just one of these saw a Bayview Lake captain, captaining a tugboat, save the entire crew of a schooner sinking in a storm off Milwaukee by sailing out into the storm on his own initiative to help tow the U.S. Life-Saving Service's rescue boat out to the schooner. The life-saving boat couldn't make it out to the sinking schooner on its own because the waves were too rough. After towing the rescue boat out to the schooner, the lifesavers successfully got the crew off the sinking schooner and into the rescue boat. Then the tugboat, which remained standing by, towed it and its crew of lifesavers and the saved crew of the schooner safely back to the shore. Perhaps most significantly, no one had asked the Bayview Lake captain who was in charge of the tugboat for help. He simply saw the danger at hand, and without hesitation sailed out into it to help those in peril. Bayview truly had some real and great heroes as its lake captains. The captains weren't immune from the appeal of a new card game craze that had grabbed a hold of Bayview in the late 1800s. It was called Cinch, and it was quite the rage of Bayview at the time. Milwaukee newspapers abounded with announcements and reports about these games. Several captains hosted them at their Bayview homes during the off-season winter of sailing, and were participants in other cinch clubs in their neighborhood. There were 3 lumber barons, an exaggeration for fun. Lumber yard owners is more accurate, in Bayview, and 2 of them had once been Bayview lake captains. One of these set up his lumber yard at the intersection of Kinnickinnick and Howell Avenues, the only one in Bayview, on the site of what is today Collectivo Coffee. Altogether, they owned and used 27 different ships to bring down timber from the northern woods of Wisconsin and Michigan, and sometimes employed Bayviewers to captain these ships for them. They weren't immune from tragedy. 17 of Bayview's 71 lake captains, 24%, lost either infants, young children, or older children below age 30. The total number of these deaths was 30, and 17 of these were infants, which equates to 24%, or about 50% above the national average of 15.71% for infant mortalities in America in 1900. One captain lost 5 sons in infancy. One Bayview lake captain was arrested and put in jail for public drunkenness, and soon thereafter was personally pardoned by, wait for it, the governor of Wisconsin. It was the first time in Milwaukee history that a man convicted of drunkenness in Milwaukee courts was pardoned by a Milwaukee governor. It probably didn't hurt that this Bayview captain was a member of one of the, if not the most famous and influential maritime families in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Great Lakes history. Lake captains didn't make a lot of money. The romantic vision that tends to come to mind for many people when the term Great Lakes Ship Captain's Home, aka Lake Captain, is mentioned, is a grand, turreted and gingerbread-festooned Victorian mansion on a cliff overlooking the lake shore. But the reality was, and is, much different. They were really just the owner's hired hands, and lake captains' homes were working-class homes. They were working-class people, and even at that, only a few amongst them were fortunate enough to make it up to the upper rung of that category. Even the grand homes of some sea captains on the U.S. eastern seaboard that meet this beautiful home vision, mostly, though not always, came about only after these fewer captains diversified into ownership of businesses related to their sailing days: shipbuilding, cargo, other local seagoing infrastructure. In other words, when they became owners of the types of businesses they used to sail for. But as strictly sea, or lake, captains, their chances of having such large and beautiful homes was much less so. As previously mentioned, of the 118 different homes Bayview lake captains lived in, 75, 64%, are still standing. 14 different homes were lived in over the course of history by more than one Bayview lake captain. Of these, the home that hosted the most different captains, 4, was on Linus Street, and it still exists today. They tended to hop around a lot when it came to living in Bayview. Only one remained in one house for their entire career. One captain lived in 10 different Bayview homes. One Bayview lake captain commanded the staff at a lighthouse in New York. Another captained a lightship that, when positioned at its anchorage in Lake Michigan, was 5 miles off Escanaba, Michigan, near Green Bay. And, as mentioned previously, The brother of another was the keeper of Milwaukee's Pierhead Light while he lived on Wentworth Avenue. Yet another captain's brother either captained or served aboard lightships for 20 years. Finally, the man that created Bayview, Eber Brock Ward, lived in a lighthouse on an island in northern Lake Huron for 3 years in his youth, while his father was lighthouse keeper there. One Bayview lake captain travelled the nation in his youth in the early 1900s as a member of a travelling theatre troupe, worked as a cowboy, punching cattle for 4 years, and was assistant property manager for the Opera House in San Antonio, Texas, for 2. One was tried twice, and acquitted by a jury both times, as acting in self-defence. Another had once been a police officer that shot and killed a burglar in self-defence. One served in the Civil War, and another registered for the draft, though it's unknown if he served. Another Bayview lake captain hand-carved and built in retirement, and entirely by himself, a 75-foot-tall wooden flagpole in the form of a 2-part ship's mast that was prominently installed in front of the then-new Milwaukee County Courthouse. And lots more. It wasn't just the heroism they often exhibited sailing the lakes. This admirable trait appeared in other ways too. 2, and possibly 3 of them, married women whose husbands had died and were left alone with young children. These captains took on the care of these children and raised them as their own. Wonderful. They also knew each other well and looked out for each other. One captain branched out into lumber operations and hired an underemployed fellow Bayview lake captain with 6 young children at home to captain one of his schooners. This deal also made this underemployed captain's wife Bayview's first, one and only female shipowner. See the companion book to this one, mentioned earlier, for the details. Another Bayviewer reached out to hire an unemployed man with a young family that had no seagoing experience and trained him to be an engineer on the excursion ship he owned and operated. And still another Bayview captain became president of the Milwaukee branch of a maritime charity that in 1892 nationally raised and donated $300,000 in 2020 dollars to families of lake captains lost on the lakes. In the days before technology like radar, GPS, radio communication, and other related maritime technological advancements, all of Bayview's captains were involved at some point in their long careers in ship groundings, collisions, and many other accidents out on the lakes. Literally, there were so many such accidents documented about Bayview's lake captains that when an attempt was made to assemble a table that summarized all of them together in one place, it totaled so many pages it couldn't be included in the book. However, all are still included in their entirety inside each individual Bayview lake captain biography found there. For this introduction, though, these have been summarized to give you, the viewer, an idea of the dangers they faced daily, in addition to their many amazing sailing adventures, which are also described in the following slides. Their sailing exploits and activities, to include their families, made the newspapers across the Great Lakes 1,409 times. Of these, 133 were on page 1. In addition to these, individual Bayview lake captains were the focus of dedicated, in-depth and lengthy feature news articles about them 32 times. All but one exclusively in the Milwaukee papers. These features mentioned don't include many more captioned photos of them that appeared over the years, nor some of their extensive obituaries. The details of their many sailing adventures are both stunning and breathtaking. Many survived their ship's sinkings. One survived 3 sinkings, 2 of which were different times captaining the same ship. Likewise, Another one also survived 2 sinkings of the same ship he was captain of. 3 Bayview Lake captains, sailing together, survived the sinking of their 3-masted schooner destined for Bayview with a load of Christmas trees. Another schooner sank in a storm in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He was transporting it from Milwaukee over to Ireland to its new owner, and was pulled from the water only by the chance of another schooner that just happened to be passing by. 2 were shipwrecked. 1 lost his vision in his right eye from the years of sailing through ice on Lake Michigan in brilliant sunshine, when sunglasses were not yet being manufactured and were thus unavailable. This same captain had such an amazing connection with the namesake, Milwaukee, that it is almost unbelievable. 1 was the car ferry SS Milwaukee, that famously sank in a huge storm in late October 1929, with the loss of all 47 members of its crew. He had been a mate aboard it only 1 month before it went down, and had survived the same storm on a different ship. When bodies of the Milwaukee washed ashore, he was called in to identify them, and even identified some wreckage as being from his own quarters when he was aboard. Then, when the wreck of the Milwaukee was found in 1963, he was the one that made the announcement of its discovery to the press as Grand Trunk's Terminal and Car Ferry Superintendent, headquartered in, you guessed it, Milwaukee. Next, when a new namesake ship, the SS City of Milwaukee, preserved today in Michigan as a museum ship, was launched the next year, 1930, he was named its first mate. Finally, he became captain of the SS City of Milwaukee in 1938, and remained so for the next 18 years, until 1956. Another left the safety of the shore to sail out into a huge storm on Lake Michigan in a tiny open boat, not much bigger than a lifeboat, and attempted to rescue sailors from their sinking ship, and succeeded. This same Bayview Lake captain, who lived on Bay Street for over 3 decades, is credited with saving 2,500 lives on the water, the most in recorded U.S. life-saving service and U.S. Coast Guard history. He was so legendary that even in his retirement on Bay Street, another and different currently serving Bayview Lake captain turned down an interview request from a Milwaukee newspaper reporter, suggesting instead that the reporter interview this retired Coast Guard lifesaver. Some adventures were fun. Several participated in schooner races, which were popular among captains and crews of the late 19th century. 2 set Great Lakes sailing speed records, one of these by making the Chicago to Buffalo run in his schooner in 4 days, 9 hours. Other adventures were so outrageous they were almost funny. One Bayview Lake captain had an arrest warrant issued for him by Milwaukee authorities, though officially and legally he was listed on the warrant as Captain John Jones, since they didn't know his name. His offence? He let his ship block traffic on the Grand Avenue Bridge for too long, at 15 minutes. After subsequently departing Milwaukee, he sailed into a huge storm on the lakes just a couple of days later that damaged a lot of the ship. He and his crew were lucky to survive. Somehow, he and the crew patched the ship together and made it back to Milwaukee. As soon as the ship docked, the police marched aboard and promptly arrested the captain. When he appeared in court, the judge set aside the conviction, but not the fine. A different Bayview Lake captain slammed his ship in error into a grain elevator in Milwaukee's harbour that didn't knock it over, but instead bent it on its foundation, turning it into a perfect replica of Italy's famous Leaning Tower of Pisa. Artists subsequently flocked to Milwaukee from around the Midwest to sketch it. While some took up the sailing profession from the very beginning, even going back to age 12, One followed a different path and became a lake captain purely by accident. He initially spent several years working as, wait for it, a full-time gardener. 4 others left the profession, though one of these was temporary, to secure more stable and safer employment at Bayview's rolling mill, becoming a rope splicer, a carpenter, a rigger boss, and one even a foreman there for 20 years. Several Bayview lake captains encountered ice storms out on the lakes that were so severe their ships literally looked like giant blocks of solid ice when they made it into port. Many of Bayview's captains rescued and saved lives at sea, 2 even rescuing the captains and their families that were sailing aboard with them of ships they had just collided with and sunk. Still another had his ship struck by lightning. Not an unusual occurrence at the time, it happened a lot. 2 more, one the current captain, and the second his first mate and Bayview neighbour, and a future Bayview lake captain, were rescued, along with all the passengers, on their beached ship during a huge storm off the coast of Michigan. The rescue was accomplished by a legendary mechanical contraption known as a breeches buoy that the U.S. Life-Saving Service launched from the shore and winched everyone to safety. 8 Bayview lake captains were reported in newspapers as being lost and drowned during storms out on the lakes, only to reappear days later, sailing into port safe and sound. And it wasn't just storms that made for an interesting life on the lakes. Some captains used carrier pigeons to send and receive messages from the shore before Morse code and radios were invented. Another Bayview lake captain that lived on Potter Street was solely responsible for, and in charge of maintaining and keeping ready and secure, the many steamships, as high as 22 ships during his tenure, famously photographed, that spent their winters in Milwaukee Harbour. This, while he was also simultaneously captain of one of them, that he sailed out of port with the 22 others in the spring. For nearly 25 years, another Bayviewer commanded a ship whose sole purpose was to keep harbours and harbour entrances open from shifting sand by dredging them periodically. When his career concluded, he had dredged many of the harbours of both Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. One of the more interesting sailing adventures of a Bayview lake captain, having his home on East Lincoln Avenue at the time, came when he braved a storm and huge ice fields on Lake Michigan that had blocked him in port in Grand Haven, Michigan, for the previous 5 days. After waiting and waiting, he decided to go for it and chance the gale-force winds and ice in order to get his ship's cargo of 21 railroad cars full of all the beautiful brand-new furniture to the Pfister Hotel in time for its grand opening in 1893. He made it. 16 are buried at Forest Home Cemetery, the most at any cemetery. They aren't included in the Famous People Buried Here tour, but Bayview can and should be just as proud of them. One captain, who drowned in Lake Michigan in the exact same spot his father drowned, neither of their bodies were ever found, has a gravestone only at Forest Home. Almost all of Bayview's lake captains, all cemeteries combined, in addition to Forest Home, are buried with their wives and some of their children. One wife, who after 52 years of marriage and living on Dover Street for 41 years, learned her Bayview lake captain husband had just died, herself collapsed and died 3 days later, at the very moment his funeral services were being held. They are among these families buried together. 5 also have captain on their gravestones, perhaps one of the biggest statements that could be made by their families of how much it meant to them and their families, and even to Bayview. 2 were killed in shipboard accidents. Another 2 were hit by either railroad trains or streetcar trolleys, Which one is unclear, one of which was killed, and who happened to be a brother in one of, if not the most famous shipping families in Milwaukee or even Wisconsin history. The other had to have his foot amputated, but kept on sailing as a lake captain. Finally, another Bayview lake captain has no known final resting place, his cause of death a mystery, though it has been deduced from available information that he drowned during a storm while captaining a schooner on the lakes. You'll find all this and more in the episodes that follow on this channel. If you've found the aforementioned partial information to be interesting, then there's more to come, and much greater detail on each captain and Bayview's maritime history. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. This photograph isn't about Bayview or its lake captains, but it's from the same era of Great Lakes maritime history. We thought we'd close with it for enjoyment, as it captures the spirit of the era. If you'd like to read more about Bayview's lake captains, please go to our website. In addition, this channel and its matching website also plan to support various maritime history projects related to Bayview's lake captains. One of these is a plaque and marker with the captains' names and addresses on it, as part of the creation of the Bayview Lake Captains Historic District, which will be the first of its kind in America. If you would like to support these projects, to include this and other markers honoring Bayview's lake captains, with 100% of all contributions in all forms going to support them, please go to our website. If, for some reason, we are unable to secure these markers, then all funds donated to this site will be given as a cash donation to the museum ship SS City of Milwaukee in Manistee, Michigan. That is the only surviving intact ship once captained by at least 2, and likely 3 different Bayview lake captains. I'm Simon Stanhope, narrator for these episodes. Join us again soon for the next chapter of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains.